Hey everyone, and welcome to our C++ tutorial on inputs and outputs. So I have Visual Studio Code pulled up here. This is the development environment I'll be teaching in. And as we know, we have our sort of hello world initial startup code ready to go. So we're going to be covering input and output streams. So now to understand what an input stream and an output stream is, we first have to understand what is a stream. So I'm going to create some space here, and I'm going to start a comment. We'll put in our definition of a stream. So a stream, we're going to define as a series of digital signals, either being transmitted to an external source or received from an external source. A stream is a series of digital signals either being transmitted to an external source, such as a monitor, or received from an external source, such as a keyboard. So in the example we have here, cout, this prints hello world out to the console and to our monitor. So this is an example of output, an output stream. So if you could kind of imagine a stream of data going out from our program to our terminal or to the monitor. So let's just get a definition of what cout is. So just to define cout really quick, cout is an output stream that can write data using the insertion operator, which is this, to a default destination determined by environment. So cout in 99% of programs and in 99% of environments, cout's just going to print to our terminal down here. So if we, compile our program here and we run it, we'll see that hello world is printed out to our console. Perfect. Something else you can do with cout is you can also print different types. So what I'm doing here is I'm printing hello to my, which is a string, and then I'm going to print 5, and then I'm going to print, which is an integer, and then I'm going to print out friends, right? So let's compile our program here, and let's run it. Oh, I didn't save this, sorry. Let's try this again. So what happened was I didn't save it from the environment to the file. So when I compiled it, it just compiled the old file. So now let's run it again. And we see hello to my 5 friends. Cool. So as you can see, when you want to print something out in the same line of code, but it's a different type, you need to use the insertion operator. You need to separate this string with the insertion operator so that you can use a new type. And so that's generally what cout does for our output stream. So that's the output stream we're going to be covering is, cout, and that outputs data to the console. So similar to just like a print statement in other languages. Okay, so let's talk about the sister to cout, which is cin. Cin. So cin is an example of an input stream. So let's have a quick definition for cin up here. Cin is an input stream that takes in one variable at a time and assigns that variable to the parameter passed into it using the extraction operator, or this. Cool. So you can kind of see how cout and cin are similar. Cout uses this insertion operator, and cout uses the insertion operator, and cin uses the extraction operator. Now, cin is different from cout in that it needs a variable to hold a value. So let's create a variable here called name. And I'm not going to assign it to anything. Normally I would assign it to give it a value, but for this example, we're not going to assign it to anything. And I'm going to use it with cin. So we will take cin as our parameter or take name as our parameter to cin here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out our variable here. And what I'm going to do in the beginning here is I'm going to say something like enter your name. Save that. And I am going to compile this program, and I will run it. It says enter your name. I'm going to enter in Pete, and we see name is Pete. Cool. So that's an example of using cin and cout as an input stream and an output stream. But there are a couple rules you need to know for cin, in the same way that we need to know a couple rules for cout. So I'm going to give you the example before I actually tell you the rules. So what we'll do is we will run our program again. So enter your name. I'm going to enter in Peter Grappentine here. And so you see that our name here is just saying Peter. Well, what happened to the last one? Well, cin, as we saw in our definition, it takes in one variable at a time. So what that means is that it interprets a variable based on since we passed it a string, it's going to take in only a string. If we tried to put in an integer, it wouldn't work. If there's a space or a return or something like that, it's going to say, okay, well, that's the end of our first variable. And so in this situation, I put in Peter Grappentine. And so this space here indicated to cin that a new variable was starting, or a new parameter being passed into our cin object was starting. So cin sees Peter Grappentine here as two separate items, and it only takes in one item at a time. So that's something you need to be cautious of when you're using cin. For the sake of a lot of our examples, I'm going to want you to not use cin, but it's important to go over it because it's sort of the sister object to cout. Instead of using cin, I'm going to want you to use Getline. Okay, so what is Getline? Create some more space here. Getline is a member of the C++ standard library that only works with strings. It's a function that takes two parameters. It reads input variables until there is a new line character represented when you hit enter. It stores that string or that value that you enter into the variable that you give it. So that's kind of a long explanation. It's actually very simple. So Getline, I'll give you an example. So here we have cin, but we know that cin will take only my first name and not my first and last name. So Getline is special in that it'll be able to take my first and last name, and it needs two parameters. It needs an input stream, which is our cin. Remember, cin is an input stream. And then it needs a variable to store the value. So we're going to use our name variable up here. So Getline uses that cin stream, and it uses it in a way that it can take multiple parameters and put them all into the same variable. So remember, cin thinks like every time you use a space, it's a new parameter, right? So, or a new item. And so Getline kind of gives us a little way around the rules of cin. So let's compile this and let's run it. So we're going to put Peter Grappentine as our name. And remember, before when I hit enter, it only showed Peter. So now let's try it again. And we see Peter Grappentine. Perfect. So this is an example of how to use Getline with our program here. This is a 2000 level course, so a lot of people have taken IT 1050, and you're used to seeing variable declarations and instantiating objects and stuff like that. And we haven't instantiated an object of cout. We haven't we're calling Getline just in general. There's no object that we're calling Getline on. And the same thing with when we saw cin. And so these are all very special objects that are in the standard library, right? So if we scroll up, this namespace std stands for the standard library. So we're pulling in the standard library and we're accessing these objects and this method directly from the standard library. So cout is an instance of an output stream, right? And cin is an instance of an input stream. So they're special to this language, and they have these special operators here, these overloaded operators. A lot of, as we get deeper into this with establishing variables and creating objects and stuff like that, that's all going to look more similar to if you've seen C# and Java. It's going to look more similar to that. These are just special cases and some syntactic type things that C++ does. I would like to discuss too some catches with these objects, or some finer details here. Particularly with Getline, it only works with strings. So if we go down, clear this, and we try to use an integer, let's create an integer called age. And instead of saying enter your name, let's say enter your age. We're going to use Getline, which only works with strings, but let's try to use an integer and see what happens. We'll say age here. And so let's compile this down with our G++ compiler. And we have an error, right? So it won't compile. So the compiler, what's happening here, so let's scroll up to see our error. So we see that when we tried to compile it, we got an error, and it says there's no matching function for call Getline, right? And so it's referring to our Getline call right here. So this error matches with this line here. And what it's saying is that Getline only works with strings. So it's looking for a definition for a Getline that takes an integer, right? We have an integer. So the compiler is going through line by line, and it's saying, oh, we know Getline. Getline takes a input stream and a string. It's like, oh, but this isn't a string, it's an integer. Well, let's see if we find a definition of Getline that has an integer. It looks through all of its definitions in the standard library. It's looking through all of the different methods, and it can't find it. So it's saying, hey, we don't have a function called Getline. It doesn't exist. What it's really saying is it doesn't have a function called Getline that takes an integer. So if we switch this back to name, and we'll save it, and we'll say, enter your name again. And we'll print out name, just like we did before. If we go back to our terminal, we'll clear out the terminal. We'll use our compiler. We'll run it. We'll say enter your name, and it works again, right? So we can do our same. Oh, because it printed out our old variable here. So that was my mistake. So let's compile it again. Clear this. We'll run our program. Okay, and it works. So previously we saw that error because Getline only takes a string. We try to pass it an integer. Now, so that's something nice that you can do with cin though. So cin, unlike Getline, can take an integer. So let's switch back to enter your age. We're going to store our input in this age variable, and we are going to print out age. So I'm going to clear. We will we'll compile it. We'll run it. We'll enter our age, 34, and we print out age as 34. So you can see what's happening here. We have our two variables named. We have an output of enter your age. We take in an input of 34 here, and we store it in this age variable. And then we print out our age variable at the end here. Perfect. Okay, so what happens now if we have our age variable here, but the user doesn't enter a valid type for our age variable? So if I enter in a string, it says enter in your age, but if I enter in my name, it prints out as 0. Now that happens because Peter doesn't evaluate to a number, right? So cin is pretty smart actually. So if you gave it a string and you entered a number, it would translate that number into a string and print out the string in our line 24 right here. But cin is not smart enough to take a name like Pete and convert it into a number, because that doesn't make any sense. So let's try it the other way though. So let's say enter your age, but let's actually put in our name variable here. And so we know that our name variable is a string, and let's print it out as if it was an age, right? So we will compile this, and we will run our executable. And so it says enter your age, and even though we have a string variable that the input is being stored into, I'm going to enter in a number, and let's see what happens. It works fine, right? So cin is smart enough to take our input of 34 and store it into our name string variable, right? So cin is pretty smart, but remember, it can only take one item at a time, right? So if we enter in two entries, or two items, it'll only take the first one, and it'll store the second one for later. So those are some sort of basic points of cin, cout, and getline. And there's a lot more to, as I previously said, there's a lot more to input and output streams than just cin, cout. C++ is very rich in that regard. But these are the basic ways of input and output that we're going to be using for this class to create sort of interactive programs. So we're kind of building our foundation on which we're going to we're going to use that foundation to learn other things. So um, yeah, this is sort of like the broad strokes of C in, C out, and Getline for input and output. Thanks.